Greetings and welcome to episode 4 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation, about 10 minutes at a time, learning the thread of the story of the greatest story ever told. We're on Genesis 1, and after a couple introductory comments, wanted to get right into Genesis chapter 1. You know, the way the Bible begins is a pretty simple manner, and one of the interesting things is that over the years, Genesis chapter 1 is a very complex epicenter of a very divisive theological and political issue. Talking about Genesis 1 with your friends or neighbors can create a firestorm of controversy because for some Christians, the interpretation of Genesis 1 and the issue of creation versus evolution is a litmus test to determine whether somebody is a real Christian or not, according to whether you interpret these opening verses of the Bible their way. The issue gets focused around the issue of creationism and evolution, and how many people see them as incompatible or either or. That is, you have to either believe in one and not the other. And the battle has been going on ever since Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. It came to a head in this country with the 1925 Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, where the school teacher John Scopes was charged with illegally teaching the theory of evolution in his public school classroom. It's a battle that rages even today, the issue of creation versus evolution as a litmus test of who is a Christian and who is not. And it focuses on the interpretation of these verses in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God, the Ruach is a Hebrew word, was moving over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day, like we talked about yesterday, the last episode. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. Kind of a two-tiered, kind of a flat earth, two-tiered universe is what's pictured. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called sea. And God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees of the land that bear fruit and seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. God said, "Let the lights expand, let there be the teeming creatures." I love this. "Let birds fly above the earth and across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, the Loch Ness Monster maybe, or even Sasquatch. According to their kinds, God blessed it, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. Now, one of the important things that we'll be talking about in these episodes is in reading and interpreting the Bible, to read it with a discerning mind. A discerning mind. You can read the Bible simplistically, but if you do, you often come up with the conclusion that it is of your own making and not the making of what the Bible writers had in mind. You have to read the Bible with a discerning mind and ask yourself the question, for whom were these verses written? What was the original intent? What was the historical context of these verses? And the most important question, what are these verses trying to tell us about God? And what is the biblical writer trying to tell us about our relationship to God and our relationship to one another? A simplistic reading of Genesis doesn't answer those ask those questions, oftentimes lead to different, perhaps erroneous ways of understanding the biblical text. Because fundamentally, the Bible, the story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, is a love story between God and God's wandering people who continue, we'll see again and again in these episodes, who continue to wander again and again away from God. But at the same time, the Bible tells us of God's never-ending search for the love of God's people. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is the way the Bible begins to tell us, to underline the fact that this whole story begins with God. God is the main character in the Bible. God is the main actor. That's how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then at the end, as we saw before, then I saw at the end of Revelation a new heaven and a new earth, for the old first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Between those two verses, between the first heaven and the new heaven, lies the whole story about God's love for God's people, a story about how we wander away again and again from God's love, but how God continuously continues to draw back his wandering people. Now, part of the firestorm about the interpretation of these verses comes from the interpretation of the Hebrew word yom, which is translated in the English as day. Now, in the Old Testament, the word yom is used 2,300 times. Sometimes it refers to a 12-hour period, like the sun coming up and the sun going down. That is a day, yom. Sometimes it refers to 24 hours. Sometimes it refers to 3 days. Sometimes it refers to a much longer period of time, like the Yom of King David, the era, the time of King David. The word Yom is also translated as an age, as an epoch, as a much longer, unspecific period of time. The word Yom can be translated as 12 hours or an epoch, an age. So Hebrew is a poetic, Hebrew is a picture language. Hebrew is not a scientific, linear, rational language. So when we, in our scientific, logical, linear, Western mind, hear the word day in Genesis 1, we think of 24 hours, logical, linear, specific, scientific. But in the Hebrew text, especially in the first chapters of Genesis, the meanings of the words are much more symbolic and poetic than they are specific and linear and scientific. Not only that, but in the Hebrew language, there are far fewer words than are used in the American textbook. If you know the meaning of 641 Hebrew words, you're able to understand and translate 80% of the Old Testament from 641 words that you might know. 80% of all the entire Old Testament comes down to 641 actual words. Hebrew is story. It is poetic. It's ancient. It's picture language. Now, again, as I said at the beginning of this episode, I said that one of the most important things to read the Bible with is a discerning mind. You can read the Bible simplistically, or you can read it through the translation into English, which is a far much more complex, rational, linear Western mind. If you read it in just what the words say, in English, it's far too difficult to get at the root meaning of what the original writers meant. You have to read the Bible with a discerning mind and ask yourself, for whom were these verses written? What was the original intent of the writers, and what is the historical context of the verses? Most importantly, what are these verses trying to tell us about God and about one another? Because when you read the story of Genesis 1 that way, what you don't get is a story about how God created everything in 6 24-hour days. That is Western linear misinterpretation of the original Hebrew. What you get is from the story of Genesis 1 is that God thinks you are awesome. That's what you get. God created, and God looked at it at the end and said, this is good. When God created the male and female in Genesis 1, God looked at them. God looked at creation and says, man, this is really good. What you look at is God taking this void and this mess and creating an orderly world out of it, and creating a man and a woman who are the crown of creation. And God looked at it and said, man, this is awesome. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters at the beginning, and out of that primordial soup, chaotic soup, God started to create an orderly world. What we learn from Genesis 1 is that God seeks to bring order out of chaos, and that the man and woman who he created were the pinnacle, the height, the goodness of creation. So God spoke, and it was so. God creates dry lands and great sea monsters and trees and plants, fish. God created it all in an orderly way. And God looked at it and said, this is very good. This is awesome. Not only this is awesome, but you are awesome. Remember, when you wake up in the morning, think to yourself, it's going to be a great day. And when you go to bed at night, think, what is it for which I am grateful? End the day with gratitude. Begin the day with thinking and saying to yourself, it's going to be a great day. I look forward to being with you on episode 5. Till then, bye-bye.